Hello, I'm Levi Cornelson, and in this video I'm going to lay out a concept for tabletop role-playing game theory and a lens for examining it that I've been hammering on for a little bit now, which is the lusory mindset. To get started on this, let's go to the original source. In his book, The Grasshopper, Bernard Suits aims to define what a game is, and he goes pretty deep into details on his definition. One of the things he mentions, mostly in passing, is the idea of a lusory attitude, which is a mindset where one accepts inefficient rules and deliberate obstacles in order to get play. Those things make a space for play. The attitude is a mental shift into a state of play dealing with those things. He also includes in his text the idea of the intent to play well, whatever that means for the game. Now, this isn't so much a theoretical bit as a pretty plain description of something that we definitely do experience. When play starts in a game of poker, you adopt a particular attitude and a particular mindset. Same thing happens with chess, although because the rules and obstacles of chess are different, the attitude is different. And again, if you're playing apples to apples, the attitude differs. And this brings us to tabletop RPGs. Tabletop RPGs have just such a changeover. They have a move into a particular mindset, and we do experience it. We talk about getting into and getting out of play. We don't generally think about it as a particularly big deal, but it's definitely there. However, tabletop RPGs expand the range of what playing well can mean, and what exactly constitutes the rules varies depending on who you ask. So there's not one lusory attitude appropriate to tabletop RPGs. There are many. There are often many for a single game, which means that either we need a different concept here, or we need to amend and expand the idea of the attitude as it applies to our games. Obviously, given that you're watching this video, I'm going to expand and amend it. And I'm going to do that by comparing and contrasting it to other theories of play and nicking bits off of them. For a starter on those theories, let's first consider the entire class of playstyle taxonomies. These can be formal, like Bartle's taxonomy, or very casual. We already might say that someone puts on a power gaming attitude when they come into play, or a tactical one, or a collaborative story-making attitude, on and on like that. We make whole typologies of players, and they're already pretty neatly tied to attitudes that we imagine them putting on consistently. We also make typologies of games based on the attitudes we think they provoke, with intent or without it, or support. If we take that notion that there are many attitudes towards play and look at these typologies, they just look like people trying to list or systematize various attitudes. So the first thing that I can add to our idea is that the various play styles are the outcomes of various attitudes. If we like, we can also use the word approach and say that your attitude and approach and play style are mostly the same thing, just with slightly different framing. One thing that saying play style does, though, is it gives a sense of something fairly fixed, while attitudes are obviously changeable and approaches can be switched out easily. You can change your approach. In reality, it seems like the truth mixes these. Many people have a fairly distinctive play style and will regularly look for specific things in tabletop games, but people will also come to play of different games with varying attitudes and build new approaches to play as they go through a game. Saying that they build those approaches is deliberate there. People bring some parts of their approach to a given game from past gaming, but they also develop them based on what they see others doing during play of the game, from what the rules say you should be doing during play of the game, from what good choices look like in terms of optimizing a character, from the goals that the game appears to offer, from principles that are written down and aren't written down, from fictional activity of the game itself, from the presentation, and everything about it. In short, attitude comes from experience, it comes from preference, and it comes from context. And that's where game design comes into this. Design, fiction, and art all present significant chunks of that context that attitudes get built on. Not all of it, but enough to care. Now, as long as we're dealing with taxonomies... Nope. Yep. Let's turn to Roger Caillois and his book Man, Play, and Games. In it, he goes at length into a definition of play, and then has a taxonomy. The taxonomy has two types of play: paida, freewheeling fun, and ludus, more serious play, often with deeper rules. It also has four forms of play: agon, alia, mimicry, and ilinx, which I always fear that I'm pronouncing wrong. Competitive, gambling, role-taking, and thrill-seeking, or vertiginous, like seeking vertigo. I spent a lot of time with this taxonomy. I have my own kind of zine of theory, which is manifold, that expands that list enormously and proposes that seeking out these various kinds of enjoyment is fundamental to play and the construction of play styles. I like this theory a lot. From the perspective that we're working here, though, where attitude is everything and approaches are constructed, these things mostly just look like useful atomic elements. So let's say that from this perspective, that's a nice atomic breakdown of pieces of play styles. It's worth calling on when one wants to get into the fine details of what kinds of enjoyment and satisfaction an attitude sets you up to engage with, and if that's being supplied and supported by the game itself. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the most influential body of theory relating to tabletop RPGs in particular, and how people design them, which is the stuff that came out of the Forge. This was an online forum, now closed, that strongly influenced what we now think of as the indie scene in tabletop RPGs. The parts of Forge theory that most relate to what I'm going on about here are the bits called creative agenda and agenda clash. So let's focus on those. So creative agendas, on the face of them, are just another taxonomy, and a fairly limited one, dividing group approaches to play into gamist, narrativist, and simulationist, or GNS. This taxonomy was built out of one that was used earlier on Usenet, and that one split it between gamist, dramatist, and narrativist instead. What made this novel and applicable to what we're talking about was that GNS had the hard assertion that it's easier to run and play a game if everyone has the same approach to play, and the group agenda is unified. Naturally, GNS said, games should pick one of the three agendas and push it forward. Now, the experience of a lot of people is that, games are easier and smoother to run if people have coinciding or similar approaches to play. It's less effort. But it's also perfectly possible to reconcile disparate approaches to play, and it happens all the time. To pull from the example that was used most on the Forge itself, original source Vampire, first edition, provokes a power gaming attitude through its cool powers. And it provokes a story-oriented one in its text, and it doesn't reconcile them at all. It doesn't address this. So you can get a table with someone who's there to play superheroes with fangs, and you can get another person who is there to have a character-driven soap opera, easily, and both of them firmly rooted in the text. And then you can have a bad time, or at least an exhausting one. This is, from a Forge perspective, a clash of agendas. They are different places in the GNS setup, and it's not working because of that. But the fact is that some people made Vampire work just steamrolling right over that problem. Many went over it so hard they didn't even notice it existed. And for a close relative of Vampire, in system terms, Exalted pushes creating story through use of cool powers, You have outrageous abilities, you use them all the time, and that drives the resolution of situations and the creation of new situations as you make a mess. As you gallivant all over creation like the pack of rogue demigods that you are. Exalted is prepared for exactly that split in attitudes, and it is built to reconcile them. Now, much of what I've just said can just be copied and pasted right into our conception of there being loads of differing attitudes. They do clash. They can be reconciled. It can be easy or it can be a lot of work. Game design can aggravate this. Game design can assist in this. But game design doesn't absolutely rule it. And as a way of talking about how game design doesn't manage this absolutely, let's talk about Jimmy. Jimmy is playing some old school D&D. He's part of a younger group. They're using all the old rules. Gold as XP, the fighting man, the magic user, the thief. Lots of save or die. The party bickers over who gets the magic items. In the game, one night, as the party sleeps, he declares that he's going to kill them all and take their stuff. Jimmy has a cutthroat attitude to play. Now, Jimmy might tell you that it's obvious that gold as XP means that getting money is winning. He's supposed to be a shifty thief. He's acting like a shifty thief. Players clearly accept death as just a thing that happens, and characters are allowed to fight each other. He's seen that at the table, right? So why isn't this okay? And the answer, of course, is those bits are only part of the context. Other parts of the context make it clear this is much too far to go. He's noticed and held on to the parts that support being a jerk and ignored the rest in support of his preference. Jimmy is being a jerk. He's just doing it through the game material. But that process of having a preference, noticing material that fits it, holding onto it, and assembling a playstyle, a whole approach around that, that's entirely usual. And Jimmy's attitude isn't invalidated or exempted from being a lusory attitude just because it's a terrible one. A cutthroat attitude might work somewhere, just not in the game Jimmy is playing. Valid and appropriate are separate things. We can also say fairly confidently that the designer of the game didn't create Jimmy or instill jerkishness in him. That's not something a designer does. We could say that the designer is responsible for culling every possible thing that might create a wrong impression, and thus a troubling attitude, and some people effectively do say this. That is a particularly strong stance. I don't hold to it. I think a more reasonable expectation is that the designer is responsible for giving a clear, positive vision of play on which good, satisfying approaches to the material can be built, and making an effort to handle any approaches the material is also obviously going to prompt. Whew. Lightly connected to this concept of the group approach, as in Creative Agenda, a moment to talk about flow and the idea of the second shift. This is the idea that as play progresses, sometimes some or all of the players get further into play. This might be as simple as becoming engrossed enough to start losing track of time. It might mean feeling fully immersed in their character. It might mean feeling like the group has an excellent riff going on and they're just building off each other really neatly. In any form, it generally fits the description of a flow state, which is worth looking up and paying some attention to. These states always require first shifting into a basic lusory attitude and then moving further on, which is why I call it a second shift. And I bring it up in reference to the Forge theory because descriptions of it tend to suggest it's easiest to get into this kind of thing when the whole group has attitudes that are grouped together in the same range, giving them, in essence, a kind of group approach, which draws it quite close to that concept of the creative agenda. For our last theory to steal from, let's take the magic circle. To quote Homo Ludens by John Huizinga, The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice, etc., are all in form and function playgrounds, forbidden spots, isolated, hedged round, hallowed, within which special rules obtain. All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart. Okay, so here at the origin in Homo Ludens, the magic circle is just one place among many others where special rules obtain. Now, this concept got expanded on and applied in video games by others, particularly Salen and Zimmerman in Rules of Play, talking pretty heavily about the territory of the game as a distinct, separate state, place, thing. There's a lot going on in the book, all of which makes for very interesting reading. But when you come at this material through the lens of you put on an attitude and an approach to play in order to play games, a lot of the magic circle stuff kind of vaporizes. It just becomes, yeah, that's what happens when you put on an attitude toward play and approach it. But not everything vaporizes. One thing that remains pretty firmly, even through the lens of you put on an attitude, is that point of origin, the actual concrete playground. This space of play, entry into which is a focus for prompting the putting on of the attitude and which helps maintain it. Imagine that you're about to play Cthulhu by Gaslight. The keeper turns down the light a little, not that much, you still need to read your character sheets, and lights up an oil lamp just to set the mood. The focus on the room changes, the smell changes, and you shift over with a feeling of, yeah, here we go. Now we're into play. And we knew this. This is news. It should shock nobody to hear that a good atmosphere and a small ritual startup helps get you into the right attitude for playing, helps maintain it, gives it a clear entry and a clear conclusion. But that same statement carries a little extra weight when you're locked in on Ensign's mindset and attitude, move practical approaches, and set playstyle. A literal magic circle produces the imaginary one by those means. Okay, for a last point without drawing on any specific theory, it's worth noting that things that the group agrees on can be fully incorporated into player mindsets, player attitudes and approaches at different rates and with varying degrees of friction. And these mindsets aren't remotely absolute. Here are two examples of incorporation. A player can be excellent at chess playing at home, and then they go to a tournament and there's a clock. For the first few rounds, the clock is trouble to them, it's clumsy, they fumble with it, and then slowly it becomes incorporated into their attitude and approach to play. Incorporation. Likewise, a player can be told in an RPG quite clearly that character death is just part of regular play, but it doesn't really sink in and affect their play until after one of their characters gets splattered over a wall. Time is required, and sometimes events, to incorporate pieces into approaches. And on the front of attitudes and approaches not being any kind of absolute, a player can bring a mood to a game, have it carry through their approach for play in ways that shift their attitude outside of what's usual for them. Someone frustrated with their day might gleefully, deliberately take it out on some fictional enemies. Someone actively trying to keep a firewall in between their character's emotions and their own might have some leak through anyway in what's called bleed. So, to recap, people shift into particular mindsets for play. These can be described as attitudes and approaches. I'm using lusory attitude as the catch-all for this. You might not need to. These are marked by a desire to play well, and it's what playing well means to that person that defines them. These attitudes can clash. Those clashes can be reconciled. Work may be needed to do that. Games can prompt those attitudes, support them, and help reconcile them. Games can also be cherry-picked to support desired attitudes, which might not be appropriate to the actual game. Game designers can be called on to provide a clear vision for play, which fitting attitudes can be built on. Play that is framed by making the venue or the platform feel right can provoke and reinforce those attitudes. Incorporating new things into an attitude and an approach can take time. Mood and emotion can easily pass through these mindsets. Now, most of that ought to feel fairly obvious and pretty straightforward. And that's part of the point of this. By pulling these pieces out of the various theories and meshing them with the concept of the attitude, we can render them much more plainly, building towards clearer utilities and exposing things that we want to build on to simpler reality testing in the form of, hey, does this match your experience in this field? And I think taking this one step out of the abstract and towards the concrete is quite valuable. Thank you for your time.